Going to take a deep dive into emissions, into how these regs have adversely affected our trucking industry.
So the EPA is just a government body, and like most government bodies, they really don't understand the science of what it is they're regulating. They're just an ideological body. They have a goal in mind. They figure this is the best way to reach the goal. This is what we're going to mandate. But the problem was they were mandating something that had more impact on the country than they ever initially realized. They thought it was going to be a simple deal, not nearly as complex as what it would become. And they never once, I don't think, looked down the road and looked at the ramifications, how this was going to affect the national economy and the bigger picture. They didn't look at the bigger picture. They just wanted less smoke out of the stacks. They didn't care how it happened, and they just knew they'd get more funding the more they made it happen. So all of a sudden you've got all these engine manufacturers trying to figure out how to redesign these engines so they don't exhale. And it was an engineering disaster because it affected the way the truck engine worked. But these manufacturers were mandated to this. So by 2007, engine manufacturers were really feeling the pinch. They thought they had a system that was going to work for them using a diesel particulate filter and DEF fluid and this type of thing. They thought they had an engineering system figured out, but the problem was that the system made the truck engines unreliable because they couldn't inhale. They were collecting all this junk in this particulate filter. Didn't know how to get rid of it. They try to burn it off with a regen system. They're trying to cut down on the stack smoke past that filter by shooting DEF fluid or urea onto the smoke or whatever you want to call it, sending it through another filter and hoping what wafts out of the stack that's left at the end of the day is acceptable for the emission standards the EPA has imposed. And truck engine reliability went into the toilet. And not only that, these engine manufacturers, and they all had done this, they all spent millions trying to develop systems to make these engines work under these new emission conditions. They spent millions, and a whole lot of the time they weren't satisfied with the results, no matter how much research and development they did. It just wasn't looking good because the reliability of the engine was just plummeting. And it got to the point by 2010, and the EPA had drawn a line in the sand at 2010, and that was going to be their next round. If you didn't meet the requirements by 2010, they were going to squeeze down and clamp down even more. And Caterpillar basically said, you know what? We don't think that you can make this work. They were suffering. They were like everybody else. They were suffering warranty claims. They were suffering huge downtime. They were suffering lawsuits. And Caterpillar, at that point, bowed right out because they said, you know what? This isn't a viable reality here. It's just not going to happen for us, and we're not going to waste any more time and money on it. So, and that's what happened to Caterpillar.
Maybe we could throw the question into the chat how they feel emissions or the emissions control has affected them as individuals.
Sure, because it's affected everybody, and the engines were so unreliable there from about 2009, 2010 onwards that the truck drivers that relied on their trucks to make a living, it's funny how that works, decided they needed workaround solutions. And this really spawned the growth of glider kits and in-framing older trucks and things like that because the cost of a new truck with all this emissions equipment on had skyrocketed somewhere between an extra 10 and 20 grand on top of the price of what they've been paying for before. In the meantime, the EPA had also mandated that they change the fuel quality. So all of a sudden, instead of making diesel fuel with oil, we're making diesel fuel with corn and soybeans and everything else, which was great for the farmers, but it was not great for the transportation industry because that stuff was unreliable. It gelled. It still does. They still have issues with it. And the filters plug, the engine shut down. So the whole emissions thing has been really destructive. It's been devastating for the trucking industry, but they show no signs of backing off. I think the whole thing was poorly implemented. I think they rushed it. I think if they'd given us, 50 or 75 years to develop the technology, we would have gotten there. But instead, they crammed it down our throats with these deadlines about when these emission standards had to be met, and it devastated the industry. The effect on the state of California has been devastating. It's put like small mom and pop trucking companies right out of business because they just couldn't afford to, the new technology. It affected the guys pulling containers out of the yards down there. It affected the produce industry, something huge because here we're seeing a long-term effect of that now. Here I was looking at produce rates the other day, and produce rates last week from the West Coast to the East Coast of the United States, the average produce load was paying $10,000. And this is in off-season for produce. And the reason for that is because so many small outfits, single guys, independent, small outfits, hauled produce. And now guys like me, and there's thousands and thousands of us, just won't go to California anymore because they don't want the fines, they don't want the hassle. The reefers have to meet emission standards as well. The reefers are shutting off, the produce claims are huge, and a whole segment of our trucking industry just quit going to California because it just wasn't a practical business decision for us to continue to do that anymore. And now they wonder why the produce rates are so high, but that gets passed on to the consumer. So what happens there? Everyone is now going to pay more for groceries. That's the end result of that. And I'm sure the EPA hadn't thought any of that through. All of the engines really performed very well before the EPA started having the manufacturers monkeying with them. Cummins was a top performer. Cat was a top performer. Even the Detroits at the time, which were ranked third, still built a pretty good engine when they went to the 60 series motor. And reliability, and you've heard me say this before, reliability is everything in trucking, especially for a small guy. And what was lost was this reliability factor when they started bringing in these emissions regulations. And trucking companies, this is interesting, trucking companies were buying spare trucks because their trucks are going down all the time. So they've got spares sitting in the yards, and they'll tow them out, swap them out with the one that's quit on them, and bring the other one back. But the little guy can't afford to be doing that. So there's how it affected small business trucking, for instance.
Kevin Dixon, DEF and regen are a scam shoved down the trucking industry's throat. DEF, when mixed with diesel, is killing plant life and honeybees.
That's an interesting comment about the honeybees, because we saw that in a documentary not too long ago. And
it was scary.
It's sad, scary, frightening, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
But a lot of the repercussions and long-term effects of things they do aren't felt for years. And it just amazes me that they'll throw something on the market and then worry about it later. Just why, the mentality escapes me. But here we are. We're losing are honeybees by the millions.
Yeah.
And now they're just starting to notice. But is the EPA gonna change? No. We'll just
Not their concern.
no, yeah, they'll just make them extinct.
What were the developments by the engine manufacturers to engines to meet the emissions control standards? And how did the engine manufacturers manage with these imposed changes?
CAT has bowed out. International has basically gone broke and don't produce motors anymore because they couldn't. And Cummins and Detroit are struggling to make these DEF systems work, and with varied success. And the whole thing, they're all monitored with sensors and stuff like that. Someone wrote me the other day now that and I believe it too, that Cummins has decided just to make throwaway engines. Now, the newest Cummins engines are basically what they're going to be is a throwaway. So you can't in-frame them, you can't rebuild them. They're just junk at the end of the day, and they go into a garbage pile, which, is a sad statement, but I entirely believe it because they're so darn expensive to run diagnostics and fix the things that it's just cheaper to get, a whole bunch of more parts from China, glue them all together and put them out on the market. But
A great comment, Michael Mueller. Manufacturers don't make money on engines that don't break down.
and that's
Wow.
he's right. Well, I know that the dealership shops now are doing very well. Some of those guys are running $120, $130 an hour trying to fix these things. But most truck owners, after a while, have to say to themselves, you know what, that truck's in the shop more than it's on the road. I've had to refinance it twice just because of the cost of it breaking down, and I'm not going to do that anymore. And that's what's happened to even some of the big carriers have bowed out, and that's partially because of the cost of trying to keep their equipment running.
What have truck owners done to fight back and survive these imposed changes?
They've come up with all sorts of workarounds that have yet to be shut down by the EPA. Probably glider kits was the biggest solution they came up with, and a glider kit is basically a rolling truck with no motor. So the guys would take an old motor, like a Cat or a Cummins, rebuild it and stick it in a brand new truck and have no trouble with it. And the glider kits were a great solution. They were selling like hotcakes, and now, of course, the government says, well, that's kind of a loophole. We better do something to shut that down because the emissions are still the same. We're not improving on the emissions. So
A comment from Nate Mars. I have a heavy wrecker and at least 20% of my tows are DEF issues.
Oh, I can believe that all day long. I talked to a guy a few years back in Idaho, and he'd bought a hugely expensive tow truck. He said it had a rotator on it, and it was like $300,000 or $400,000, and he said he was sweating bullets on whether he was going to be able to pay for this wrecker or not. He said the thing paid for itself in the first year towing these emission trucks into dealerships. He paid for the truck in the first year of operation. There were so many guys, so many trucks just shutting off left, right, and center. And this is just in this little area of Idaho. The oil fields. And the oil fields employ thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And all those oil fields now are cutting back production. Like look at the price of a barrel of oil. It dropped from over $100 a barrel a couple of years ago to God, sometimes it's been hovering like $25 a barrel now. And that's an industry that's in the middle of being devastated by this whole thing. But there's no industry to replace it. And where are all these people going to work? And how are all these people going to eat? And at the end of the day, it's the truck owners that pay, and it's the public that pays. It's the taxpayer that pays. Your groceries have gone up. The cost of your new vehicle has gone up, but you're unemployed because they killed your job in the oil field, and it's on and on and on.
Columbia George comments, I was broke down 5 days in Elko, Nevada due to DEF issues.
And that is not an uncommon story. I love Elko, but it's not exactly a transportation hub. There's a couple of truck stops there and on Denny's, and that's about it. So you're waiting for parts, and the parts have got to get out to Elko from probably Salt Lake City or Reno or someplace like that. So there's downtime, and should the driver sit for free while the truck is broken? I asked a big carrier here that question here not too long ago, and he just kind of hummed and hawed and shuffled his feet. And what that meant was they were having all sorts of trouble with the trucks, but the drivers were sitting for free. They were still getting paid by the mile, so the drivers were sitting while the trucks were in the shop, while they're waiting for a tow truck.
Michael Mueller, wonder when Air Force One gets a DPF and a DEF.
Oh, you just know that Air Force One isn't running that kind of equipment. But
now what? What happens now? The development of electric trucks? Is this the answer? Will it work? Why or why not? And how will this affect the company driver and the owner-operator? What do they do? How do they handle this?
Good questions. And you know, they've been experimenting with other types of fuel, and you've seen them in the truck stops, like stations for propane and that type of thing, and natural gas, but none of those systems seem to be panning out for the trucking industry. So it's almost certain that the trucks of the future will be electric, and that's fine, but it's going to affect the industry all over the place. It'll pretty much, my guess is, it'll pretty much mean the end of owner-operators, because owner-operators, there just won't be the money in it to invest in a truck like that and then hope that you get enough work to pay for the truck. Company guys, not going to really affect company guys. It'll affect trucking, though, because the trucks won't be able to go as far. So you'll end up like what we had in the 60s, where trucking companies had terminals all over the place. So you'd take it from one terminal to the next, and then the next guy would hook onto it, and then the next guy would hook onto it. So you're hopscotching across the country because of these electrical systems, or they're going to need the truck stops to get on board and invest hundreds of millions of dollars in these charging systems, whether the state has the power grid to support them or not. So big trucking companies, it'll even change the way big trucking companies do business. A lot of them will look at the cost and the expense and say, you know, this just isn't worth our while. We're never going to get the stock market to invest in trucking on a break-even proposition. And with the cost of this new equipment coming down the pike, we're going to run out of investors. Lots of rich guys are investing in electric trucks, but they're not going to invest in trucking companies. So that's what's it's going to change. It'll change the face of the industry, and California wants to see that by 2035. It's not going to happen by 2035, but you'll certainly see California and a few other states make a large jump in that direction. And that's going to change the trucking industry, because all of a sudden there are going to be a whole bunch of states that you can't truck to, or you won't want to truck to, because there are fines involved. And it's just going to change the way we do everything, just because of this mandate. They took something that worked really, really well, and they messed with it. And even as kids, when we were monkeying with old cars and stuff, we learned that if something worked really, really well, you didn't mess with it. But yet, the EPA and the government haven't learned that lesson yet. Take care, keep the rubber side down, and we'll see you on the backhaul. Good night, everybody.
Good night.